Hi everyone, it's me again, your host Faraha, and I am joined by Anna and Catherine, our BSL interpreters, and it's now time for our keynote speakers. Just a reminder that we are also running in parallel our last data zine sharing session and also a pre-recorded video by Grace Quantock on data and trauma. With that being said, I'm going to invite Professor Teresa Dillon back onto the stage to introduce our keynote speakers.
Great, thanks, Farah. I'm delighted that we are able to wrap up this really engaging and exciting day, and also one year of data with this keynote, which focuses on the commercialization of private personal data and also how we can learn how to control that better. I think that over the course of the year, and particularly in the showcase today, we saw some really key examples from the prototype teams around how they're actually developing solutions in some ways to this, or if not creating solutions, engaging a kind of a public discourse on the topic, particularly here thinking about Tracy Bone's work on controller, and also Vanna's work in looking at corporate responsibility around data land register use, and many other projects as well, which have been actually touching upon this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. As I've been introduced, I'm Teresa Dillon, Professor of City Futures here. I'm streaming from my home this afternoon. I identify as a white European of Irish descent. I have a red hairband on, and so behind me are yellow and red and largely a white background. Our first speaker will be Professor Stacy-Ann Elvy. Stacy-Ann is Professor of Law and Martin Luther King Jr. Hall Research Scholar at the University of California, Davis School of Law. Her research focuses on commercial law and privacy and its relationship with emerging technologies, human rights, and law. Stacy-Ann has a book forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, which will be released in May, which looks at these issues in terms of corporate law, privacy, and security for the internet. And she also is an advisor to the American Law Institute Principles for a Data Economy. We welcome Stacy. Following Stacy, thank you. Following Stacy's presentation, I'll introduce also then Jaromil. Jaromil, also known as Denis Roio, is an inventor, an advocate of free and open software, and a developer, thinker and creative technologist. He holds a PhD on algorithmic sovereignty from the University of Plymouth, and he co-founded Dyne as a think and do tank, which works on various European projects, including Decode, which looked at how we can support controlling and our own personal information and data on the internet. So we have a great combination here of a scholar and academic, also with a technical advisor, thinker, doer, maker, and hacker. And I think this is going to be a great combination in terms of looking at this topic. Stacy-Ann.
Hi, everyone.
Stacy-Ann, I give the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Teresa. So I'm streaming from my home. I'm a Black woman and I'm wearing a black and white shirt, and my pronouns are she and her. So first, I'd like to extend my thanks to Professor Teresa Dillon and to the Southwest Creative Technology Network for the gracious invitation to participate in today's keynote conversation. So in terms of an overview of my presentation today, I'll start by first discussing the U.S. approach to data protection, and then I'll move on to covering the data as property proposal, as well as the personal data economy and pay for privacy business models and programs. I'll also then conclude by highlighting a few possible privacy concerns that I believe these approaches may raise. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the dominant view of privacy that is memorialized in US privacy frameworks today is that of privacy as control, right, which has been reduced to notice and choice. The US has also adopted, as we know, a sectorial approach to privacy, right? And under the sectorial approach, various laws and regulatory bodies essentially govern different industries. More recently, there has been some movement at the state level to provide more data protection to individuals, and I can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Notice, as we know, implies that companies, through their privacy policies, their terms of service, and other statements, provide us with information about the data they collect, and how they use, disclose, and transfer the data. Choice implies, right, that we have the option to consent to or reject to companies' data practices, products, and services. Through this consent, individuals can grant or authorize companies to obtain rights in the data they generate, right, including the right to process, aggregate, and anonymize, and transform, and even potentially transfer the data. These rights, as we know, can include, for instance, a grant of a royalty-free and irrevocable license to use the data, right? The provisions of which are oftentimes contained in a privacy policy or more primarily a terms of service agreement or conditions of use. Research on individuals' understanding, though, of companies' disclosure statements, such as privacy policies, suggests that it is likely that oftentimes individuals do not fully understand these documents or grasp the implications of consent. In some cases, some individuals mistakenly believe that the existence of a privacy policy means that their data will not be disclosed or shared with third parties. As I note on the slide, one study of privacy policies estimates that, quote, if internet users were to annually read the online privacy policies word for word each time they visited a new site, the nation would spend about 54 billion hours reading privacy policies. Another study found that most individuals do not, or most companies, do not follow the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission guidelines, to adopt shorter privacy policies. And so the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, right, that's an important federal agency that really plays an active role in addressing privacy and security related issues. Now, these studies challenge the validity of individual consent in data trade transactions under the notice and choice approach. Another related issue that's connected to individuals' understanding of the implications of consenting to share data through companies' terms of service or privacy policies is what can subsequently then happen to this information, right? So for instance, today, most companies' online terms of service, as well as their privacy policies, can contain provisions that authorize the transfer and disclosure of individuals' data in various corporate transactions, right, or potentially corporate events, right? And that includes mergers and acquisitions, as well as bankruptcy proceedings. So one thing that I think is notable in the bankruptcy context in the US is the extent to which the notice and choice approach has also been incorporated into bankruptcy law, meaning that the terms in the privacy policy can determine the level of protection that's given to the data in bankruptcy proceedings. So given all of that, there has been, or I think there is some consensus among legal scholars that the notice and choice model has not been the most effective framework, right? Or at the very least, relying heavily on the notice and choice model to essentially do most of the heavy lifting in terms of protecting individuals' data, right? That it has not been, again, the most effective framework. So in the last few years, seemingly newer solutions have been offered with the aim of providing additional protections for individuals' data. So one proposed solution that has been offered is that data should be treated as property, right? In other words, individuals should be granted a property right, so to speak, in their data. So for instance, as I note on the slide, Andrew Yang, a former US presidential candidate, he stated in 2019 that, quote, our data is ours, right? It should be. At this point, our data is more valuable than oil. If anyone benefits from our data, it should be us. I would make data a property right that each of us shares, right? End quote. Other individuals have also made similar proposals as well. Yang, I believe, also proposed that individuals be granted several rights, including the right to opt out of data collection and to be informed about what data is being collected. So I'm going to focus on the data as property aspect of this type of proposal, right? The question of who owns the data or who has rights in the data we generate, it's a complex one. And the data as property solution raises, I think, its own concerns. So one issue is possibly how to value an individual's data versus aggregated data, right? So even if you were said to have transferable property rights in our data, it then potentially raises the question of whether an individual would have any type of property interest in the aggregated and anonymized data that companies compile. There are also some cases, case law, right? Some cases involving privacy-related issues in which courts suggest that an individual's personal information really has no value that the individual can essentially expect to be compensated for. The other, I suppose, more important issue with this approach is that it could further contribute to the commodification of our data, right? So in the same way that individuals consent to granting companies rights in their data through the privacy policies and terms of service agreements that I mentioned earlier, the same thing can occur if individuals were possibly granted property rights in their data. Lastly, it's not entirely clear whether granting individual property rights, right? Granting individual property rights in their data would increase individuals' understanding of the implications of transferring those rights to other entities. So you recall I mentioned earlier that there has been some discussion about the value of individuals' data as opposed to the value of aggregated data. And to some extent, newer business models and programs may challenge that view. And primarily here, what I'm referring to is the personal data economy, right? In which some companies purport to provide platforms that allow individuals to monetize and be directly compensated for, in some instances, their data. So now turning to discussing the personal data economy. So some PDE, personal data economy companies, provide platforms, various platforms for individuals to compile, aggregate, and in some cases obtain insights from their data, as well as provide access to their data in exchange for various offers from unaffiliated entities. Other PDE companies have purchased or obtained a license to use individuals' data directly from individuals rather than relying on established companies, for instance, such as data brokers, to provide to provide them with user data. So as I note on the slide, I think that a company such as Digi.me, Digi.me, right? Digi.me falls in the PDE category. So moving on to the pay for privacy models in programs. In my view, companies that adopt this approach fall really into one of two big categories. The first category is the privacy as a luxury or privacy as a paid product category. And under this approach, companies offer privacy or security-centered products at moderate or expensive prices. So for instance, organizations that offer VPNs, virtual private network products or services, they generally require users to pay a subscription fee, right? And in my view, these are PFP, pay for privacy services. Innovative privacy wearables and anti-surveillance devices also to some extent provide examples of this approach, right? Researchers and some companies have developed various clothing and accessories that include masks, goggles, and other wearable products to, for instance, confuse facial recognition technology and possibly also to prevent our identification. In addition to privacy wearables, there are other products that are now being sold to block the surveillance features of IoT, Internet of Things devices, right? And so IoT devices, as we know, these are basically all of the standard objects that we have in our homes, for instance, that are all connected to the internet, right? So our televisions that are connected to the internet, our refrigerators, so-called smart washing machines, right? All of these basic ordinary objects are part of the Internet of Things. So getting back now to the anti-surveillance products that I was mentioning earlier, right? So these anti-surveillance devices can be, for instance, used to automatically mute and unmute the microphone in an IoT smart speaker. Now, moving on to the second category of pay for privacy approaches, right? And that's the privacy discount approach or privacy discount program. So when a company implements a privacy discount program, right, individuals pay for privacy controls by essentially incurring higher fees. But unlike in the privacy as a luxury or privacy as a paid product approach, right, individuals are encouraged to relinquish their privacy and data through the use of discounts. So for instance, one ISP, internet service provider, previously provided a plan that gave individuals a discount on monthly charges if they allowed the company to use their web browsing information to tailor ads and other offers. Individuals who wanted to protect their privacy, right, by declining to consent to data collection had to reportedly pay as much as $66 more per month. Not surprisingly, the company allegedly reported that since it began its PFP program, right, since it started to offer its PFP program, a significant segment of its customers chose to participate in the program, right? Because who wants to pay an additional $66 or almost $70 per month for your internet or your phone bill? So what are some of the possible concerns that these models and approaches raise? So I think one of the most significant concern that's raised by PFP models is the further transformation of privacy into a product that can be sold and purchased, right? And this occurs when we must pay for privacy. Individuals who are aware of and who can financially afford expenses associated with PFP, pay for privacy and security centered products, obtain at least, in my view, some level of data protection when compared to those who cannot afford to pay for these types of products and services. Unequal access to information could in fact also contribute to unequal access to privacy. Right. So stated differently, individuals who can pay for privacy, I think, are likely in a more advantageous position than those who cannot, in that they can afford to some extent to avail themselves of technological offerings to limit tracking and data collection. And to the extent that financially disadvantaged individuals cannot afford the prices of companies that adopt a privacy as a luxury approach, use of that approach or model could contribute to the divide between those that can afford privacy and those who cannot. So the same concern is also possible with privacy discount programs that I mentioned earlier as well. So individuals who are less financially well off could be more inclined to consent to data collection, right? Rather than, for instance, paying an additional $66 a month to avoid data collection. Some groups of individuals could be required to choose between basic necessities and protecting their privacy, right? Via a more expensive product or service. A further complicating problem in the US is that some vulnerable groups of consumers continue to have less options for online access. These individuals could be subject to increased data surveillance, right, when they eventually obtain online access, to the extent that they cannot afford the PFP products and services that other entities are offering. And I think that complicates the existing socioeconomic digital divide. Pay for privacy and personal data economy approaches also to some extent raise concerns similar to those that are found in traditional data business models. So for instance, the free and freemium models, right, including potentially a lack of consumer knowledge and understanding about data and privacy related issues, right? Individuals may not consistently understand the implications that are associated with accepting, for instance, a discount in exchange for permitting companies to collect, mine, and disclose their data. It's also unclear whether individuals engaging in PDE, personal data economy marketplaces, will review and understand any disclosures before agreeing to the transfer or disclosure of their information, right, or even the collection. And now, depending on the language and the terms of service agreements and privacy policies of PDE, personal data economy companies, third-party companies could potentially monetize or disclose data once the individual transfers or provides access to their data. It's also not entirely clear whether individuals will be able to constantly or consistently, I should say, establish data disclosure and transfer terms to exert sufficient control over how data buyers or third-party companies that gain access to their data will use the data once it's obtained. Right? These companies could simply provide their terms and conditions and privacy policies on a take it or leave it basis. Now, on the positive side, the data insights that PDE companies offer could allow users to more easily recognize the inherent value of their data, their information, right? Including Internet of Things data as well, right? So they could perhaps be able to more easily recognize the value of their data to themselves and to companies. And so these offerings, PDE offerings, could potentially increase consumer knowledge and understanding of data value. Additionally, unlike traditional data business models such as the free and freemium models that we know, companies like Facebook use, right? In those types of traditional business models, the products that tech companies offer, they oftentimes seem to be unconnected to the data transfers, right? Personal data economy offerings, right? So PDE offerings could increase transparency surrounding data trade arrangements. So one concern that's associated with the use of PDE offerings is whether this potential transparency and consumer understanding of data value and data trade arrangements will also extend to how companies, again, use IoT data and other sources of information once individuals provide companies with access to their data in PDE marketplaces. So in short, although PDE marketplaces have the potential to increase transparency surrounding data trade arrangements, it's also possible that that the issue of consumer understanding of related contract terms and the privacy implications of data sharing will continue as individuals are provided with additional platforms to monetize their data in these new marketplaces. So in my forthcoming book, which will be published this May by Cambridge University Press, I also explore PFP, pay for privacy, and PDE, personal data economy business models and programs in the context of evaluating the consumer implications of the Internet of Things. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to comments and questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stacy-Ann, for that rapid overview and detailed overview on the economy of personal data and the various different versions of it, including like the pay for privacy models and the issues and the concerns as you raised around that, particularly relevant, I think, in terms of like the continued sort of surveillance or disadvantages that might bring for particular peoples. So yeah, again, thank you so much for that, and look forward to reading your forthcoming book. Passing over now to Jaromil.
Hi, thanks, Teresa. Very interesting, Stacy-Ann. Many thanks for this. So I'm Jaromil. I am an Hispanic, Latino, curly-haired person in a white room with a door and a lamp in the shape of a D2B2 robot from Star Wars. I'm going to introduce you briefly first the organization I'm honored to be directing, and that exists first and foremost as a community organization. In the 94, we were inspired by practices of online streaming and radio and community radio online, and we evolved into a think, do tank and let's say a hacker think tank nowadays. We are driven by minimalism in design, following the Unix philosophy. So we honor modularity and also old systems from which we can understand a lot. And our methodology always refers to community engagement and empowerment, which ultimately is the goal of what we do. I've been researching on this topic also for my PhD, and not only, I must say, being a programmer, I've been dealing with the design and with algorithms basically most of my professional life. And I hope to give you an overview with this keynote about the problematics that we actually have to face when we deal with algorithms and algorithmic sovereignty in our societies. This picture shows well one event that occurred 4 or 5 years ago with the Pokemon Go adoption. Many people, teenagers, were driven by a game with game incentives to actually even cross railroads and create dangerous situations for themselves and others while seeking the prize for the game. This was a game that clearly did not took into account in its algorithm the dangers of driving people into certain locations of the world looking for tokens and rewards. So it gives you a perspective on the problem that we have when we deal with sharing economies. With sharing economies, we are basically dealing our desires and needs. And that can be a game in which we want to be winning or growing. That can be also a night when we are looking for a taxi, the fastest lift to our location, to the location we want to go. That can be also the seek for a home into a neighborhood or another, or for a vacation house. So you can think of many services online that today offer us to put us in touch with the offer. So we explain needs, we explain our desires, and then we are matched with offers. By the way, another example could be even a Tinder, even more intimate, in which we look for mating with a person that actually matches our preferences and our characteristics. So you see, this matchmaking can become indeed very intimate and can and will deal with private data. The way it deals with it is by aggregation. So we have seen that in an economical context, in a dense settlement like a city, it creates a lot of precarity, while it tends to financialize all relationships and ultimately deterritorialize them. What I mean with that is that we virtualize the relationship with the place where we live, we quantify it, and we play it on a market that is ruled by algorithms that will match desire and needs. Now, if you think of a market, that's the essence of it. A market is basically a place where people will offer things for sale and people will look for what they are looking and buy it. Now we are into situations that are very accelerated, and algorithms actually serve our needs by accelerating our seek and making choices. Think of social networks. They choose what is relevant for us as news, but we don't really know the way they choose. So we are in a situation in which we don't perceive the machines, but we are perceived by machines. What is the danger of that situation? I think, shortly put, a quote of Vandana Shiva gives us a good picture of it: the monoculture of the mind. In this process, we are normalized and matched into a framework that may not take into account all the nuances, all the background that we have as people, as individuals, as communities, as people belonging to different societies or multiple societies at once. It just narrows down our identities to something that can play well into a certain context. With the Decode project, EU-funded project that ran in the past 4 years, we try to bring forward the claim of smart city as our place, as a place for humans to draw their connections and to play their desires consciously and find their needs consciously. By putting forward the idea that personal data is a common in the moment in which it's aggregated and creates value. So it should be actually treated as a common. And I think this is very important, because if you think of the examples that I made before, we are talking about companies that are extracting data, siloing, not making it used by the people that produced it, by the municipalities, by the cities, and actually making it valuable by selling the algorithmic calculations that are done on it. What we have done in practice. So enough with the politics of it all. I think I want to give you some very pragmatic examples. There are sort of grassroots approaches to this situation, and we try to develop systems with it. One is an operating system, a GNU Linux distribution. You will ask, what does it have to do, a desktop distribution, with all this? Well, first of all, the desktop, but also the mobile devices are the main interface we use to interact with algorithms. And often they hide a lot of complexity, and they make it impossible even to technical people to analyze the complexity. So we have developed an operating system that can run also on old infrastructure that is completely free and open source, and that tries to keep the base system as simple as possible, as minimalistic as possible. We explicitly try to avoid complex systems that are running underneath. But that's not enough. The way we do it is important. We do it as a community development. We don't do it as a company producing a software that people should buy or download and use. We do it as a community of participants. We try our best to not distinguish ourselves between users and developers, but to call ourselves all participants into the process of developing a system. And I think this is very important, even in a niche effort like a software development. Here you see a photo of a get-together that we could do before this pandemic in Amsterdam. And you see the diversity that we include in our participant group is not only that of gender or ethnicity, but also age, which I think is also a very important dimension for diversity. Learning from people that have dealt with infrastructure that is legacy, that have worked in the past years, is often a great asset, although is not valued enough. Often we think that new and innovation and young is much better and we should get rid of the old. That is not our opinion. A little break with another video that you may want to see. This was from Katolats, a member of our community and old member of the Dyne network, that told us about minimalism in software design. There is a little URL that you will find on YouTube, and it's a very nice lecture on architecture and minimalism and what we can learn from it. Another effort that I like to put forward is Zenroom, and especially the Zencode language. This may seem a little obscure and technical. I will do my best to explain what we really did. It's one of the main technical outputs of the Decode project, something that has been used as a component both in Barcelona and Amsterdam, the smart cities of the future we have worked with these projects. With Zenroom, we tried to go from a very complex innovation like cryptography, so the science that manages to conceal and authenticate and sign and grant the integration of the data that we are transmitting, the science that has a champion we all know, Alan Turing, and the science that actually allow us to manage data in a ethical and private way. Cryptography, as complex as it sounds, it is a complex science, and we have to go from very complex math formulas to code to something that we try our best to make people understand. And this path is actually quite difficult because it involves interdisciplinarity. It involves people from many disciplines, mathematicians, developers, and also lawyers that, as Stacy-Ann showed us, can understand much more of the implications and the rules that govern our data. So to do this, we have developed a human-like language. That was our effort. We worked very hard for it. We managed to have very good results. And here you can see an example. But also on the website that you see linked, happyroom.net, you can try the example right now on your own browser. We have done it in the shape of a small virtual machine. So it actually runs in your browser. You're not connecting to a server when you compute. It runs locally. And what you see as code is executed on data. So you can describe data transformations with a human-like language. This is a component. It can be used in bigger applications. It can be used in public infrastructure. And we released it as free and open source in the hope that makes more people participate into the process of developing technology. We did used it, for instance, in the authentication of young people that wanted to buy beer in a pub in Amsterdam, back when we ran our pilots, and we managed to make them authenticate without showing their ID by means of zero-knowledge proof. So yeah, that's all. Sorry if I've taken a few more minutes. I didn't realize. And I'm very much looking forward for the questions.
Great. Thank you, Jaromil, and thanks also for wrapping up there as well. So we're going to extend, we were meant to be finishing at 6:30. We're going to extend now to 16:30. We're going to extend to 16:40. So we have a little bit more time for the conversation. I mean, very rich, very dense, and very clear presentations from both of you. So thanks so much for that. And one of the things that I wanted to pick up on was that point there, Jaromil, that you kind of ended towards, where you basically created a system that, you know, data transformations can act like in a human readable form. And that, for me, seems to be like the crux in some ways of what you're working towards. But before we kind of go into the necessity for that, I wanted to return to something that Stacy-Ann had pointed so clearly to in her talk regarding the notice and choice models that we basically have had to be dealing with very much. And I think everybody knows, whether you use that term or not, everybody sort of knows what that means. You look at the terms of agreement, you're given notice, you click a box, yes, everything is fine. And that's it. And that's what we have been sort of having to manage. Now, Stacy-Ann, you said that they have been doing the heavy lifting, but they're just not effective. What, in your opinion, are good ways forward out of this? And do you see something in the work that Jaromil has been doing there, where that kind of data transformation is brought into a more human readable form, in a sense, that could help us kind of out of this conundrum we have really at the moment?
All right, so thank you for that question. So I'm aware of, at least at the legislative level, one previous proposal to, for instance, limit the length of privacy policies to about 100 words and be written in a certain manner that an individual is reading at a certain grade level could possibly understand. There's also been some calls for more forms of what others have described as visceral notice. So rather than just relying on incredibly lengthy privacy policies, for instance, icons could be incorporated, right? So then when you hover over the icon, it could tell you whether data is being collected. In the IoT space, one could imagine, Internet of Things space, one could imagine, for instance, audio functions or speaker functions of a smart speaker, potentially, you know, highlighting some of the core provisions with respect to a company's privacy policy or terms of service as well. You could also have different forms of notice in terms of indicating to individuals when, for instance, an IoT device is actually collecting data or observing the person or recording. So I think that will be helpful as well. Of course, I think more empirical research would be needed to determine whether or not these alternative forms of notice of privacy policies, whether or not they're actually going to be effective as well. So I think that's certainly something to consider. In the US, something else that I think that will be helpful is the imposition of legislation that essentially requires data minimization, right? Privacy by design and privacy by default. So I know obviously you guys already have a similar regulation, obviously in Europe, right, through the GDPR, but at least broadly at the federal level, I think legislation that addresses those, that imposes those specific obligations could be helpful as well. And I'd certainly see the need, obviously, for different platforms and approaches, such as the one that Jaromil was highlighting earlier today.
Thank you very much, Stacy-Ann. And Jaromil, picking up that, I guess, conversation in relation to Stacy-Ann has sketched the kind of perspective from the US. What, in your view, given the number of European projects that you've been involved in, where do you sort of see the interesting work happening in this kind of space where there is more visibility and more control, in a sense, over the personal data?
Well, I think that there is a space that we have to open and perhaps focus more, which is the space of interdisciplinarity. Because when we talk about comprehension of what we are doing, it's not just a techie that is going to do it. It's not just like a brilliant developer. It's not a hacker that is going to save us. It's not me. We need to involve artists, designers, lawyers, sociologists, ethnographers. We need a plethora of humanities disciplines to be involved into this process. And ultimately, this is what worries me about Europe. Probably not the only place where there is a worrying slide to technocracy and an increasing governance of processes by technocrats, by people that know the technology. And actually, by virtue of knowing and not sharing, they base their power on it. One visible thing of this process, one signal, is the slide well, in academia, you can see many more people that are studying technical disciplines rather than humanities. There has been a decrease of subscriptions in humanities disciplines. And also there has been a growing narrative, even in basic schools, of teaching our kids how to code. So again, we are training ourselves to speak and think like machines. But when are we working so that the machines actually are more comprehensible to everyone? When are we working so that these algorithms and the way we use them are transparent and we can actually spot better the bias that we have been victims of when deploying them in many circumstances? So I think that it's not just, we are dealing with artificial intelligence and it's too complex to understand, it's deep learning, it's so deep I cannot look into it. No, it's a matter of designing the systems that we actually adopt in society. And I think this should be the direction we go. I hope Europe goes into that direction, although I'm not seeing many signals for it. I'm seeing a lack of understanding of the importance of interdisciplinarity in our societies.
Thank you, Jaromil. And Stacy-Ann, I guess, building on that, point around interdisciplinarity, from your perspective as a scholar of law and as a lawyer, where do you sort of see the conversation intersecting with your discipline at the moment? Because there seems to be a lot of potential power in the legislation that could come into play here. And particularly, I guess, when you raise the point of protecting those who are already in a point of disadvantage, who have not got the options to pay for privacy, and who have in then, not that option, having all of their data sort of open to the field, then are in a way more vulnerable to a form of data colonialization or possession in a sense, and extraction, etc. So I guess on one hand, where do you sort of see the conversation around interdisciplinarity happening from the legal perspective? And also, could you kind of comment on where you sort of may see the conversation going in relation to those protections for more vulnerable others?
So thank you. At the state level, there has recently, beginning in 2018, states are becoming more active in the privacy and security law space. So more recently, there's the CCPA, now amended by the CPRA, which is a California statute that provides various rights to individuals in California, including the right to opt out, for instance, of data sales and data sharing with respect to behavioral advertising or targeting. So there's a California statute at the legislative level, and a few weeks ago, I believe as well, Virginia also adopted a statute as well that gives individuals various privacy rights. So states have been somewhat more active recently in attempting to address many of the issues at that relate to privacy and security, at least in the US. At the federal level, there have been various proposals to implement baseline or at least privacy legislation, and also legislation that deals with data security issues. Whether we'll have something in the US that's akin to the GDPR, that's omnibus legislation, right? Because as I mentioned earlier in my talk, we've typically or generally adopted the sectoral approach to privacy. It's hard to say. There have been congressional hearings on privacy-related issues, but what will subsequently happen, we'll have to adopt a wait and see approach on that. I mean, I think that more states, as I mentioned, Virginia a few weeks ago, more states could potentially end up adopting their own legislation as well, and essentially following the footsteps of California and Virginia. With respect to unequal access to privacy, that point that I mentioned in my talk earlier, and I think that's part of what your question was alluding to as well. I think we'll have to wait to see what, if any, legislation is adopted at the federal level. We'll have to actually wait to see the contents of the legislation, right? And to then assess whether or not you could potentially have provisions that address that. So perhaps issues related to privacy or obligations related to privacy by design and data minimization could be helpful, right? Particularly if we think about in the IoT context, ensuring, for instance, that all devices, right, for instance, attempting to ensure that all of these devices aren't continuously collecting data, or that they always don't have to connect to the internet in order to function, right? That could, for instance, establish a basic level of privacy and security that anyone seeking to access these devices could have, right? Legislation that potentially also establishes baseline privacy rights, right, that apply across all levels. That could potentially be helpful as well. But I think we'd have to wait and see what any type of legislation at the federal level looks like.
Yeah, thank you. And Jaromil, in our kind of build up to this discussion, you also mentioned, I think, which is relevant kind of to what we're discussing here, the example in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, where actually there was the government was taken to task regarding information where they had actually identified people who were, now correct me here if I'm relaying the story incorrectly, but people who were on social welfare and who were paying above the odds, but they had actually targeted them in particular, and the government was recently taken to task. You highlighted this as a sort of an example in a way of, how kind of data, in a sense, can also be manipulated by the state to actually continue to place rules and regulations upon people who, again, are already in a disadvantaged situation. Would you mind speaking to that example so that we have it? Thanks.
Yeah, this is specifically one of the functions that algorithms are adopted and sold by companies as black boxes the most to both public enforcement, public security enforcement, and also risk assessment institutions and of sorts. In this case, in the Netherlands, it was deployed a system called Siri that used to assess the probability of fraud in the housing market, and it was adopted in poor neighborhoods of Rotterdam and I think also Amsterdam. It never detected a fraud, this algorithm. It caused a lot of problems to the inhabitants, but also its application was biased to start with. My question to the authorities that adopted this algorithm is why they don't adopt it in the rich neighborhood, where most of the financial crimes are occurring on a very high volume, especially if I'm talking about the Zuidas in Amsterdam. And this was the case also for another algorithm that was assessing the subsidies for single mothers that should have perceived a subsidy. This is not just because of poverty, but it's about the time of a person that needs to be a professional and also a parent. And the miscalculation of this went on for about 2 years, unnoticed by an algorithm. So we are talking about the side effects of an error that are very hard to calculate. We cannot actually calculate them by quantifying, because we are talking about people's life being affected. And the crisis was enough to make the Dutch government fall about 3 months ago. Unfortunately, this shows how little memory our societies have, which may be the next topic for algorithms, that they are serving us our memory on social networks. Unfortunately, on the new elections, pretty much the same people that were responsible for these mistakes were re-elected.
Yeah, no, I was a powerful example you had shared there in relation to that. In a way, as you said, the side effects of the algorithm. And I guess if, when data is aggregated, there's the side effect of the data aggregation that also will naturally or potentially cause these questions as well and issues. I wanted to also return a little bit to this point where the monetarization of data is something that is really, I think, a hot topic at the moment. And, you have a lot of conversation going on in the kind of public press, as well as in various different discipline quarters, relating to how, in a sense, Google and Facebook have been making money on our data. They are companies that has basically set themselves up on that basis. We are producing that data for them. We are the laborers. We are the workers, so to speak. How do we reclaim some of that? How do we bring it kind of back? We've only got a few minutes left, but I would just like to kind of, just ask your opinions on that, because it's obviously a key aspect of both your kind of work and to some extent as well in relation to this wider data economy. And it seems though that the kind of solutions, I say solutions here, but options to that could be like the data cooperatives, data trusts, data unions, sort of a data sovereignty model. As so many of our fellows were interested in these topics, could you have some closing words on what future directions you see this kind of work going in? Thank you.
Go first. So I think from my perspective, the thing that I'm particularly concerned about, or at least focused on, and also in my scholarship as well, is what are the terms that will be included in the conditions of use or terms of service in the privacy policies, right? So even if we're talking about a personal data economy, a company that fits within that model or approach, I think the concern is going to be how much data is being collected, right? And second, what is actually going to happen to that data after, right? And it's actually the terms of service, likely the conditions of use, whatever term you want to use, it's likely going to determine, as well as the privacy policy, what permissible uses of the data, right, could potentially happen subsequently. And so I think the focus should be, at least in my view, from a legal perspective, is the actual terms and conditions or terms of service, right? What's going to happen to the data once individuals are actually providing access to other entities to their information? And will there be any downstream or subsequent restrictions with respect to the uses of the data, right? How will the data potentially be used?
Well, I'll briefly reference an attempt at looking at solutions that I have the luck to make to publish as an article you'll find as Restorative Justice in Artificial Intelligence Crimes, co-authored with my friend Adnan Hadzi. What we propose, what I think should be proposed in light of social justice struggles, is to start thinking of a framework for restorative justice in AI crimes, in artificial intelligence crimes. It does not make sense, most of the debate so far, thinking whether a machine has standing in light of a crime that is committed. It really didn't arrive nowhere. What it made us do is forget the victims. So we need to understand how to apply restorative justice to a growing amount of crimes that artificial intelligence is going to commit. As a philosopher, to me, it doesn't make really sense to ask who has started this. I don't believe that you can end a war by asking who has started it. But I believe that you can repair the damage provoked by a war in the moment in which you focus on restoration. So I hope that we will be looking into that as societies, as modern societies.
I think that is a very thoughtful end to today's conversations and keynotes, and links so much across to my colleagues' conversations earlier this morning. I'm thinking of Jazz's session on inclusion and the restoration and reparative justice and the social inequalities that were addressed there. I'm also thinking to the data and environment panel that we had earlier on, which was calling into question as well the relationship of responsibility at this particular point, particularly in relation to climate action. And all of these conversations sort of seem to point to a continual call for just futures in a way. And I thank you for this in relation to personal data economies and the commodification of personal data, and the work and brilliant work and attempts that you are both doing to bring this to the fore and to make it more legible, I think, for all of us, which has been, as I mentioned, I think, a running concern throughout the whole data program. So I just want to close this session and say thank you so much for joining us. Particularly thank you to Stacy-Ann for joining us so early in the morning, because she's on the other side of the world, to Jaromil for eating into his evening, for the BSL interpreters, and for those who are listening. So yeah, cheers to you all, and thank you so much for closing our case.
Thank you.
Many thanks.